'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a very special show. With us today is General Daniel Bolger. General Bolger was 35 years in the military. He was commanded both in Afghanistan and Iraq. He retired in June 2013 as a 3-star general. And today we're going to be exploring what's going on in this complex area of the Middle East. Welcome to the Circle, General.
Well, thanks very much, Carl. It's good to be here.
So this is a very complex area. I don't even know where to start, but I guess I'll start off first. You had a book that came out, Why We Lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. So let's take a look first at Afghanistan for a few minutes. And you told us in part one what we needed to do to win. What do we need to do now that we've been there for so long? Should we pull out? Should we stay? What should we do?
I think the biggest thing we need to do is we need to assess where we're at. In other words, look at what's happened since 2001 when we went in and not make foolish, short-sighted decisions. So right now, the U.S. policy, the stated policy, is we're going to leave about 10,000 guys there to help the Afghan military, which is very, very new military. I mean, we've raised them over the last few years, but they're rookies. You know, Afghan people know a lot about fighting. They're very good fighters. But being a disciplined military and working as a unit and having leaders and officers and sergeants, that's new to them. They're not real good at that. The Russians, when they were in there, did it for them. They basically said, you guys don't know how to do this. We'll just do it for you. We've actually trained them. I was involved in that, work with them. But, it takes a long time. You can train a guy to be a rifleman, just to shoot somebody or to crawl around and hide, from enemy bullets. You can teach them that in a couple weeks. But trying to teach a sergeant, that takes a decade. And trying to teach officers, lieutenant colonels, how to run big units, battalions, brigades, regiments, that takes 20 years. And we've only been at it really for, as far as training the military, for a few years. So the president decided to leave about 10,000 guys there as trainers, advisors, helpers, help them with their equipment, all that kind of stuff. Their military is almost over 300,000 guys, counting the Army, the police, their little bitty Air Force, all that. They don't have much of an Air Force, so they need our air support as well. So we're going to leave about 10,000 guys. But then the president said, yeah, we'll leave them for a year. And then in another year, we'll leave 5,000, cut it in half. And then after that, we'll just cut to the team at the embassy and, we'll sort of go over every so often with a few hundred guys, make sure they're still training. Now, the challenge with that is that's what we tried in Iraq. And what we saw was when we pulled out and the Iraqis didn't have our advisors and trainers, guess what? You had ISIS spring back up from the old areas of the Sunni insurgency. In Afghanistan, you got the same problem. In the mountains in the east, in the deserts in the south, that's the homeland of the Taliban. And as we pull out, the Taliban is going to fill that vacuum. The Afghan army, they're not really ready to fight the Taliban. They're used to doing them alongside of us. And so, when you say, what should we do? It would have been great back in 2001 if we went in, knocked out the Taliban, and turned it over to the Afghans. Since we didn't do that, now we sort of have inherited these guys as our partners. We're going to have to work with them and help them. And I think what you may see President Obama do based on what happened in Iraq, he may say, well, I think I need to leave these guys here. But so far, he hasn't said that. He's still talking about pulling out. I think they're going to have to revisit that because Afghanistan is a country that has a very harsh winter. When spring comes in March and April, that's when the enemy really gets active. The Taliban starts, they call it their fighting season, when they fight, and they fight in the good weather from March till about October. We'll have to see what's going on there in March and April, but I think you're going to see the South and the East erupt. People may not be aware of it, but last year, the Afghan army suffered the highest number of killed in action that they had in their entire history with us. Over 4,500 wow. Afghan soldiers killed in action. And to put that in perspective, that's more Americans than we've lost in that war since 2001 in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan and Iraq together, we've lost over almost 6,900. But in just Afghanistan alone, we've lost almost 3,000. And I'm telling you, the Afghans in one fighting season last year lost 4,500. The Taliban are out there, and the Afghans are going to need help. And if we leave them alone, if we pull out, you're going to see what happened in Iraq. The Taliban's going to take over 2/3 of that country.
I know there's other issues when you train the Afghanis. There's a trust issue.
Very much.
Because they're going to have to be, well, look, I got to make my life, and I might make more money with the Taliban, with maybe selling illegal drugs or whatever else they're doing. How do you bridge that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned drugs. I mean, Afghanistan is one of the largest poppy cultivators in the world. It is the cash crop for a lot of the provinces there because they can grow it and they make it into opium and then, of course, sell it for drugs. And most of those drugs do not come to the United States, but they go into Eastern Europe and they go into the states that made up the old Soviet Union, places like Kazakhstan and Russia, Ukraine. That's where those drugs go. And you're right, there's a lot of money in that. And so as a result, a young man who's thinking about, should I join the Afghan army, should I join the Taliban? If he joins the Afghan army, he'll make maybe the equivalent US of $300 a month, which is a pretty good salary in Afghanistan. But the Taliban might pay him $300 a month just to plant one IED on the side of the road, one roadside bomb, one mine on the side of the road. He might get $300 just for that mission. He might also get killed doing it. That's the difference. Whereas if he's in the army, although he's at risk, he's obviously in a unit and they're all sharing that risk together. The challenge, of course, is that the guy who's planting a bomb on the side of the road, that's not considered necessarily honorable work. They know it's bad. They know it's evil and it's hurting people because, that bomb doesn't know who's going by. They might be trying to get an American, but they might get a mom taking her kids to school. And so they got to live with all that. But yeah, and then the other thing I would mention is because Americans are outsiders, sometimes the Afghans will look at us and say, well, these guys are infidels. Therefore, we'd rather throw in our lot with the Taliban, who we don't like very much, but they're Afghans, versus these Americans. And so the Taliban has actually worked to put people in the army and police who are like sleeper agents. And they'll go through training and everything seems fine. And then when they're out on a mission, suddenly they'll turn on the American guy there with them and shoot the advisor or something like that. It is a tough thing. The Taliban does it intentionally because they're trying to damage that trust between the Afghans and the Americans. And it is really, really difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be very hard to try to figure out and resolve.
Yeah, very, very, very it's an ingenious enemy tactic that they use.
And the Taliban, I guess, makes most of its revenue from the drug sales?
They do, and it's quite interesting. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan from 96 to 2001, they suppressed the opium trade. They thought it was un-Islamic. They did not accord with their reading of the Quran. But when they became the opposition in 2001, they needed money, and they made a deal with the opium traders. And next thing you know, the Taliban, who used to suppress the opium trade, was now working to increase it so they could raise money to buy weapons and ammunition.
Well, let's move from Afghanistan. We're heading to another country, another very complex situation, Syria. What do we do with this Assad? Do we do anything at all with him?
Syria is really, really difficult. In Syria, you have Bashar al-Assad, who heads a Ba'athist regime. There were two Ba'athist regimes in the Middle East. One was Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. We knocked that out in 2003 after years of tangling with them, including a major war in 1990-91. The Assad family runs the other one. His dad, Hafiz al-Assad, used to run the country. The son is actually an ophthalmologist. He was educated in Great Britain. He's an eye doctor. And then he came back to take over from his father in the last years of his father's life. The father knew he was in ill health and basically puts in the son as a hereditary dictator. And not long after Assad got into power, the Arab Spring broke out across the region, and a large number of people in Syria rose up in objection. Assad runs a minority government. He's what's called an Alawite, which is a minority within the Islamic religion. The majority of his countrymen are Sunni Arabs, just like the people in Western Iraq. And so that border there, it exists on a map. The map was drawn by the French and British after World War I. The local people don't recognize the border. I mean, the families spread across the border and all that. The Sunni insurgents that we fought used to get supplies out of Syria, even when Assad's dad was in there. And he would sort of look the other way. Now they are running the insurgency against Assad. Their goal, ISIS stands for Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Their goal is to establish a state in both Iraq and Syria that is a fundamentalist Sunni Arab Islamic state. And they are in line with the views of another fundamentalist Sunni Arab, which was Osama bin Laden. Although he's dead, his inspiration still inspires ISIS. And some of the leaders of ISIS, a name that I'll mention, active in both Syria and Iraq, and that's Bakr Al-Baghdadi. He's a guy we used to chase around when I was there with the 1st Cavalry Division in 2009 and 10. We were looking for him as one of the key enemy leaders. So he's a leader we know well. Many of his key lieutenants were guys we fought from 03 to 11 when we were over there fighting that insurgency. Now they're operating in both Syria and Iraq. They've almost erased the border there. They fight the Assad regime in Syria, and they fight the Baghdad regime of a guy named Bakr Al-Baghdadi. He's the prime minister now. He's friendly with the U.S. By the way, he's also friendly with the Iranians. And just to give that in mind, to talk about, you talk about a complex, mixed-up region. Bashar al-Assad is friends with the Iranians as well. So both the regimes that ISIS is fighting are pro-Iranian. The Iraqis are so pro-Iranian that their Minister of Interior, their Chief of Police, the equivalent in the U.S. of the Director of the FBI, that guy is a guy named Salman al-Gaban. He's a member of the Badr Corps, which is an Iranian militia. They're funded by Tehran. That's the head policeman in Iraq. And so we are in this strange position of we're allied in Iraq with a regime that's also tied closely to Iran. Iran has thousands of advisors there as well, helping them and trainers. So those are the guys working alongside us. Weird. When we were there fighting, we fought Iranian-backed militias. I mean, my guys fought them, Americans fought them. But now we're in together trying to prop up this faltering Iraqi regime. And we haven't figured out what to do with Assad. We're looking, you'll hear the Obama administration say, well, we need to find some moderate Syrians. I don't know if there is such a critter, because they're either in with ISIS or they're in with Assad, and both of those are pretty bad choices.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
You actually triggered two questions for me. I've heard this before. The Iranians actually sent in some forces into Iraq. They had actually more kills of American soldiers than any other group in there?
Very effective, their forces were. They were part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's their elite. In their system, it would be like in World War II with Hitler with the Waffen SS. They're like their shock troops. And they sent in their special ops guys. They developed special munitions that could penetrate even our big 70-ton M1 Abrams tanks. I was, 1st Cavalry Division is a tank division. So we had these big tanks in Baghdad. These devices, chemical rounds, would penetrate the side of those tanks and could kill our guys inside, even those heavily armored tanks. And those were specialized munitions that they developed and imported from Iran. We actually put guys on the border to interdict that, and our special ops guys went after them. But I can tell you, my guys, we had fights with Iranian, operators in Baghdad. We captured them, we killed them. And you're right, they were very, very deadly to us, much more dangerous than the Sunni insurgents who were energetic, but they weren't such good fighters. They weren't very good shots. Their bombs were not as sophisticated. But those Iranian guys, they're dangerous.
So we'll leave Syria now that we're in Iraq for a second. What's going to happen once we get Iraq settled? I mean, are we going to have issues again with these Iranian soldiers?
Well, I think we will. Iraq is basically a country that's cobbled together from three groups that hate each other. I mentioned the Sunni Arabs. They live in the West. There are Shia Arabs, and the Iraqis are also Shia. That's another sect within Islam. It's not an exact analogy, but it's almost like in Christianity how you got, like Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, different groups. Well, Islam has the same, and Shia and Sunni is one of the main splits. The Shia are the guys running the Baghdad government, and they are closely tied to their Shia Iranians. Now, the Iranians are not Arabs. They're Persian, but they're very Shia, and they support Shia around the world. And then you got a third group up north in the mountains called the Kurds. The Kurds are a different ethnic group. They're mainly Sunni Arab, a few Shia, and they don't like any of the Arabs, whether Sunni or Shia. So this sort of three-way setup is what goes on in Iraq. And basically the history of Iraq, going all the way back to Muhammad the Prophet, and these groups started fighting around 680 AD. So, I mean, we're talking centuries of armed conflict between these groups. The only time they ever stop fighting is when an outside authority comes in and puts a big foot on them. So the Ottoman Turks ran them as part of the Ottoman Empire until World War I, 1918. The British came in and ran them from about 1920 to 1958. The Baathists took over, who were basically sort of a totalitarian Nazi party, communist party type setup. They had a secret police. That's Saddam Hussein. And they ran him essentially with an iron boot on everybody's throat. Well, when that was pulled off, the civil war restarted, and these three groups fight each other all the time. Right now, the Kurds and the Shia Arabs are in an uneasy alliance to fight the Sunnis, but it's temporary, And so, like you said, even if we take care of ISIS and somehow finish them off, then the other two guys will start fighting because that's what they do. So it's a really, really difficult situation. And just to complicate matters, they sit on what most geologists think are the second largest oil reserves in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's actually one of my last questions of the interview. But before we get to that one, are there any other hot spots that you can think of that people aren't looking at? Maybe Yemen, Somalia, anything else that you see? Oh boy, we got trouble coming over here.
Two of them right there. Yemen, a state that's barely hanging together by its fingernails. That was a divided state during the Cold War. You know how like we had North and South Korea, East and West Germany? Well, there was a North and South Yemen. And although North Korea is communist, North Yemen was the non-socialist, the non-Soviet-backed state. North Yemen were sort of the pro-Western guys, South Yemen, the guys who were pro-Soviet. And Yemen sits in a very vital area. It sits on the edge of the Red Sea. There's a strait called the Bab el-Mandeb. It runs into the Red Sea, and you take that up to the Suez Canal. So for our European allies, almost all their oil that comes out of the Middle East goes right by Yemen. So Yemen's a state where we do not want to have terrorists in charge of that because they close that strait, and next thing you know, our European allies would be out of fuel. And once they were out of fuel, their economies would grind to a halt. People would really suffer in the winter there. So it's a very strategic area. And right across the street, across the strait, Bab el-Mandeb, is Somalia, which is a failed state. Somalia went under in the early 90s. Some Americans may remember the movie Black Hawk Down. We had gone in there to try and feed the people who were just horribly oppressed by these warlords. Ended up in a big fight with our rangers and all that kind of stuff. And then
that was in Mogadishu?
Mogadishu is their capital. And Somalia now is under the control of a group that's sort of pro-Western, and they're fighting a group called Al-Shabaab, who's like pro-Al-Qaeda. They're an Al-Qaeda knockoff. They're also active in the African country just south of there, Kenya. And so that's another place where we send special ops in there. We do drone strikes, we do air strikes. And then as you go across the Middle East, North Africa, all those countries experienced uprisings during the Arab Spring. It's actually started in Tunisia, which is right across from Italy, if you look at the map. Egypt, which is the site of the Suez Canal. Egypt, a longtime friend of the United States, is actually under the effective control of their army, which has long been a U.S. ally. They'd love to get civilians in control, but the last time they had a vote, the people elected the Muslim Brotherhood, who are essentially Al-Qaeda, and the Egyptian military didn't want to do it, but they intervened. They just said, look, I know you don't want military government, but we can't have Al-Qaeda running Egypt. And they were very worried because Egypt shares a border with Israel. And of course, the Israelis, they haven't fought those guys hot war since 1973. And the Egyptians did not want to fight Israel again. Israel did not want to fight Egypt. And we didn't want either of them fighting. So even though it's not what we would like, there's no vote. There's a military leadership there, but that's always shaky. You never know how long they'll last. Right to the west of Egypt is Libya. We know the horrible things that happened there when, in the Arab Spring, when Muammar Gaddafi, the old dictator, he was deposed. Al-Qaeda did take over part of that country. We had a horrible incident at our consulate in Benghazi. We lost our ambassador. Ambassador Christopher Stevens was killed along with 3 others of his security team. I mean, that happened in 2012. Libya is still a very dangerous country and a place we got to watch as well. So that whole region is rife with trouble. Every one of those countries is a potential trouble spot. And in every one of them, you got Al-Qaeda cells active. You know, they're not Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. They're like 2.0 Al-Qaeda, the franchised version, the wannabes, you know, people who embedded themselves with Al-Qaeda. And I might add, our own country's not immune from this, Carlos. You know, the Tsarnaev brothers, who were immigrants from Chechnya, a small area in Russia, that attacked the Boston Marathon in 2013. The Tsarnaev brothers were inspired by Al-Qaeda. And although one was killed in a shootout with the police, the other one's still awaiting trial. And you know, so you even get people in our own country who might choose to sympathize with these guys. It's a very virulent ideology, and it's very dangerous.
It really is amazing. I mean, I listen sometimes when they say they're going to cut back on the military, and I'm thinking, really? I mean, with all the problems we have down there, it seems like we need to hire a lot more soldiers or bring them into the service.
Well, I'll tell you, the things you need is you got to have a decent military. We've got a great one right now, great young men and women. We got to make sure they're resourced and looked after and properly equipped. I hope we keep doing that. We've got great intel services. I know the CIA's been beat up a lot lately about did they torture guys or whatever. Look, everything the CIA did, they talked to Congress about. They got the okay from 2 presidents to do it. You know, no matter what people say politically, trust me, to include the senator from California who just made the big issue there, she was briefed fully on that in 2002. And the record is quite clear on that point. You know, now she's shocked. You know, it's sort of like Louis in Casablanca. I'm shocked to discover gambling in your casino, Rick. You know, yeah. You know, some of that's just being done for posturing, and I don't know why Senator Feinstein went that route. But the intel services play a major role, and our first responders. I mean, our police, our fire. I mean, they have a critical role, and we really saw that not only on 9/11. But we've also seen that in incidents like the Fort Hood shooting, the Tsarnaev brother things in Boston, all these various, I mean, many terrorist plots have been foiled by good police work, good young men and women on patrol. And the most important thing is citizens. Our citizenry is pretty sharp. They do pay attention. And I'm not talking about snoopy stuff like the NSA. I mean, you can take or leave that. It's just average citizens who look out the window as they're going to drive their kids to school or something and go, hey, that truck over there, that doesn't look right. And they call the police or they go check on it themselves. It's made a huge difference. I mean, the number of plots that have been foiled by just alert citizens. And I'm not talking about nosy people or jerks. I'm talking about just people who are worried about their community and want to live a decent life. I mean, that's critical. And I'll tell you a good example that's all Americans should know. It was in the news 2 weeks ago. ISIS really wanted to make an attack on our country for Christmas. They said, we're going to hit the British, the French, the Germans, and the Americans, all the guys we're fighting against. We're going to hit all of them. And then their propaganda ministry had to admit, well, we may go after the Europeans, but we don't want to go after the Americans. It's too hard over there. Those people, you know, they're too alert. They're looking after us. Now, you can never take that for granted, Carlos, but I'll tell you, to me, that shows as a country we have learned something since 9/11. And by God, we got to get this stuff right, you know, for the next phase, for sure.
That's very reassuring. And that's the great thing about the circles. We're really trying to get out the accurate information, not the posturing stuff from the regular media that kind of can dilute everything that's coming out. Thank you so much again, General Daniel Bolger. His book, you want to get it, Why We Lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. General Daniel Bolger, Bolger. Must get over that book to read it. It's a fascinating book. You'll learn a lot about what's really going on out there. Thank you again, General. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. We'll see you next time, everyone.